Good morning. This morning we filed a lawsuit against the Illinois Department of Corrections. We are alleging that there are too many people in Illinois that are kept in isolation, in solitary, that they are kept there too long, that they are put there for too little, and that they are kept in too awful conditions. Illinois uses and other places in the country use lots of different words for what we call solitary. Some places call it the SHU, special housing units. Some people call it ADSEG. Some people call it administrative detention. Some people call it disciplinary segregation. Our position is it doesn't matter what label you put on it. It's all the same thing. It's all isolation. And when I say isolation, that means you're in a cell, similar to this cell here, between 22 and 24 hours a day without meaningful social contact. Under the United Nations standards governing imprisonment of people worldwide, 15 days or more is considered to be torture if you're kept in isolation that long. Illinois does not keep people in segregation for 15 days. It doesn't even keep them for 15 months. Often we will see people who have been in segregation for 15 years in Illinois. We have filed suit on behalf of 3 specific individuals. Douglas Coleman, who spent about 8 months in F House, an old roundhouse at Stateville. He is severely disabled. He was not given access to his wheelchair, so he was crawling or had to be carried or dragged sometimes anytime he had to leave his cell. Horrible way to treat a man. Aaron Fillmore, currently at Lawrence Correctional Center, has spent the last 15 years in isolation. He went through Tams Correctional Center, the Supermax prison, which is now closed. He went through Pontiac Correctional Center, a almost all segregation prison, and now he's in Lawrence Correctional Center. He did commit an infraction way back 15 years ago. He attempted to stab a guard and received additional criminal sentence for that. But since then, he's been in isolation all by himself without any additional charges against him, no additional opportunity to defend himself. He's finished his seg time that he got for the stabbing, yet they're not letting him out now. They allege he's a gang member, and that's why he has to be there, but he's never been given an opportunity to defend himself against those charges, never even seen the evidence they have that shows he's a gang member. Our third plaintiff, Jerome Jones, spent about a year in Stateville, also known as F House, and Lawrence both. He also is alleged to be a gang member, but has never received any disciplinary report saying he did anything wrong, that he was a gang member, anything else. They're just holding him there, no hearing, no charges, no nothing, no way to get out. He's there indefinitely until somebody decides he can leave. But we're not just suing on behalf of these 3 individuals, we're suing on behalf of all 2,300 people in Illinois who are kept in solitary today, in isolation today. 680 of those people are currently serving sentences of more than a year, and 218 of them are serving sentences of more than 10 years in solitary. And these are not people who are being put in for murder generally, or very serious offenses. 1,500 of them are there for disobeying a direct order, which can be as little as move to the back of the cell, or you moved out of line and were told to get back in and you didn't move quickly enough. 1,500 of them are there just for insolence. And these numbers won't add up because some people are in for more than one thing. 1,500 are there just for insolence. That can be rolling your eyes at a guard and you get sent to segregation. 1,500 of them are there for unauthorized movement, which often means instead of going directly to your cell after your shower, you stopped and talked to somebody in the neighboring cell before you went into your cell. Doesn't mean you tried to escape. That's a whole different charge. 1,300 of them are for drugs or drug paraphernalia. That may sound serious, but drug paraphernalia inside the prison system means something entirely different than out here. So for example, if you walk out of the chow hall with an apple, that can be considered drug paraphernalia because you could potentially use it to make hooch. So they consider that to be drug paraphernalia. A guard wants to write you up for that. They can call it drug paraphernalia and give you up to a year in segregation because you walked out of the dining hall with an apple. Damage to property, that can be anything. It can be anything from having a ripped pillowcase to tearing up your cell. We don't know what it is, but to a lot of people, In our experience, a lot of those are very minor alterations to clothing, count as damage to property. And 300 of them are there for intimidation and threats, which again can just be yelling out to a guard, "I'm going to get you," and not actually doing anything about it, just yelling. So we send people, as I said before, in Illinois to solitary far too long. We keep them there far too long. We keep them there for far too little. And the conditions themselves, this is a mock-up of a cell that exists at Menard Correctional Center. These are meant for 2 people. Many of those cells are 4.5 by 10 feet, 45 square feet. Under state law, it's supposed to be a minimum of 50 square feet per person, but they've got 2 people in most of those cells, locked in there 23 hours a day. No one I know has come out of long-term isolation without being severely mentally injured, and most people have had serious effects on their health and well-being. There's some other gentlemen here who have spent time in prison in solitary cells, so I want them to speak about the effects of it, but certainly there's lots of psychological literature to support exactly what they're talking about. We are asking the court to intervene here, to order the state to reduce its use of solitary, to make the conditions more humane, to give people real due process so they have an opportunity to defend against being placed there. Obviously, we just filed the suit this morning. The defense haven't made a response. As with every case we file, we hope that the department will sit down and discuss things with us and try to resolve this matter. But if not, we are fully prepared to litigate this, litigate it hard, quickly. We think that the suffering that's going on day to day here is outrageous and should end now.
The next person who is going to speak is Brian Nelson, BrianNelson. He is Prisoners' Rights Coordinator at Uptown People's Law Center and a survivor of solitary confinement.
Good morning. I'm Brian Nelson. I did 23 years in solitary confinement. I do the prison rights work at the Law Center. We get roughly 100 to 150 letters a week. And some of them are sad, some of them are just shocking. I went from New Mexico. I was in a minimum security prison. I walked in and out the prison every day, 10 times a day, by myself. I made officers' uniforms. I put them in their car, came back, gave them their car keys. Every car had a gun because there's rattlesnakes everywhere out there. I'm 15 minutes from the Mexican border. And then the next day I wake up and U.S. Marshals run in with machine guns, chain me up, and take me to TAMS. Didn't do anything wrong, didn't violate any laws, any rules or regulations. And from there I spent the next 12 years in TAMS until the day I was released, and then was go. I was pushed out. Prior to TAMS, I never saw a psychiatrist. I had never needed psychotropic medication. I never thought about suicide. By the time I left TAMS, I was on 5 different types of psychotropic medication just to make me sleep and to calm me down. I paced, from what they audited or monitored, 18 hours every day. And they had to cut blood blisters off my feet. Now, consider an animal in a zoo, we don't even put them in a habitat like that, because you used to see the lions in those days pacing in the zoo. Every zoo is habitat-friendly environment, except for prisons. And consider being in a cell with me as I pace 18 hours a day, if you're my cellmate. How long is that gonna last before you have an issue of, you need to sit down? And I've got buddies that have been in solitary since 1988. And he actually killed himself, and they brought him back because he's just tired. He didn't want to do it no more. And that's what all of us go through. And like I was saying earlier, we all have a little closet somewhere. I've got a place in the basement where I go hide. It's pitch black. And I can just sit there and I cry. I see a psychiatrist every week for 1 to 2 hours. I cannot ride an L train. I cannot ride a bus. And as I talk about and think about it, I start tasting the cell again because it was raw, dusty concrete. And the sad part is they took me and they pushed me out and gave me to my mother, talking about, here he is, he's your problem now. One difference with me than everybody else that was paroled, I had to have a reintegration evaluation, mandatory by parole, that a psychiatrist says I was not going to lose my mind after what they did to me. Otherwise, they were going to civilly commit me. Now, that's a hell of a thing to say when you're talking about we're rehabilitating somebody and sending them home. You're going to make me so I'm violent? Or you think that I might be violent? Well, why didn't you help me before I came home? I asked. I begged in writing and verbally to all the mental health, help me get ready. And I still have a lot of problems, and next week will make 5 years that I've been out. And how do we do this to another human being? That's the sad part. And one of the tickets that always sticks out to me, a guy that had been locked up for 20 years looked at a woman, and they gave him a year in segregation because he said he had lust in his eyes. Now, as a male, if you've been locked up 20 years, you're going to look at a woman like that, you know? If you don't, then you need to see a psychiatrist, you know? And they gave him a year in seg and made him do all of it, and he already had a mental illness. So when he got out, he had more problems. You know, and every one of us that comes out of there, we're your next door neighbors, and nobody will know that I suffered this unless I tell them. You know, so that's why it's so important. And also, I'm proud to have a working job. But a lot of the guys that got out of TAMS are on Social Security for the rest of their life because they can't cope being in a room with people like this. And I'm shaking, I'm sweating, and I'm starting to pick my fingernails. And I pick my fingers until they bleed because I'm afraid to be around people. And this is what happens after 23 years by myself.
The next person who's going to speak is Mark Clements, MarkClements. He is a survivor of police torture under John Burge and also a survivor of solitary confinement.
Hello, my name is Mark Clements, and I represent the campaign to end the death penalty. At the age of 16 years of age, I was tortured by Chicago police, and I found myself inside of a prison. A kid sentenced to natural life, told that you would never, ever go home. The Illinois Department of Corrections is unrealistic, its rules are barbaric, and it must change. Here it is, we have human beings. We have seen that in the state, man and woman walk out that has been declared innocent. We have seen time and time again where that the city of Chicago have shelled out millions of dollars for its psychological torture. What is occurring inside of the Illinois Department of Corrections amounts to torture. You heard Brian describe what torture is. As the result of Richard Speck, this is what our lawmakers decided to do. They decided to wipe out all rehabilitation and to make prisons a miserable nightmare. That is the exact words of our former governor, Jim Edgar. He wiped out rehabilitation for segregation. He took away what little education for isolation inside of a prison cell. We have shelled out, last year alone, in Cook County, that is, $50 million dealing with wrongful convictions and tortures. Over the past 10 years, we have shelled out over $500 million. My plea and my cry, Brian was a kid when he went to prison. I was a kid when I went to prison. People can look at me and people can say, well, you look normal. Well, I was tortured inside of a police station. I was tortured by a judge. I was tortured by prison officials. Then I was kicked out of prison and told that I'm supposed to survive. How? You never taught me anything. The things that I learned on my own or with the aid of a few compassionate correctional teachers. We must tell it right and we must get it right. I support this lawsuit and I urge our governor of the state of Illinois to investigate our prisons. It is a shame for human beings to be placed inside of a prison, and when they are released, they are returned back into society worse. Something's wrong with that picture. In closing, I know the plots and the plans of our prison officials. They were literally allowed too much power. And being granted this power, they have literally used it to wipe out individuals that enter its system rather than to help these individuals. We're calling out to you, the people, this morning to have a heart. And when you see Governor Rama, ask him to investigate Illinois prisons and end torture. Thank you.
Our last speaker will be Latanya Walker, LATONIA-WALKER, and her brother is in solitary confinement.
Good morning. I have a brother that's at Stateville. He's in solitary confinement. He's been there for a year now. I have petitioned the state to investigate pertaining to my brother. Not only that, he had a hernia that he had for 5 years when he was in Cook County. He was fighting the case. When they transferred him over to Stateville, they never looked into any of his medical records. The guards, the wardens, the counselors there, they ignored him repeatedly. He requested that they look into his medical records because he had medication that he had to take on a daily basis. They did not do it. Come to find out, his hernia that he had dropped into his scrotum. When we notified the state ended up rushed and contacted Stateville warden. Stateville warden immediately sent my brother out to UIC, then made a request that my brother return back to Stateville. He's back in solitary confinement. His wound is open. He's hurt very badly. He's saying he's in pain. Everyone at Stateville is constantly ignoring his pleas, his requests for medication, for treatment. The treatment at Stateville is horrible. So I just really, just ask the people to get involved with our loved ones, get involved with this system alone, because they're taking our people, they're taking our youth, and they are destroying them. They are making animals out of them, in which they are human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Alan, have the courts not spoken on this issue already?
I would say not definitively. Justice Kennedy, just last week, in the context of a death penalty case, strongly suggested that lawyers ought to be filing these cases, and he sort of invited the opportunity for the Supreme Court to rule on it. What the Supreme Court has ruled is that prisoners who are sent to long-term segregation ought to have a due process hearing. We don't even think Illinois is complying with that. But we're going one step further, saying that no matter how much due process you give them, isolation itself should violate the Constitution. And Justice Kennedy has invited lawyers to file that case. We are taking him up on his invitation.
Just to be clear, this is a federal civil rights suit.
Correct. We have filed in the Northern District of Illinois here this morning. I don't know what judge has been assigned to, but yes, in the federal courts here in Chicago. Any other questions?
Mr. Nelson, can I ask you a question? I apologize for making you have to relive any of this.
I do it regularly.
When you were taken into Tams, what was the reason you were given for being put into solitary?
Well, they asked me why I was there. When I went to the so-called transfer review committee, they said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Well, you chained me up and stuck a gun to my head and put me on an airplane and flew me here." And they said, "Well, what did you do wrong?" I said, "I didn't do nothing wrong." And that's how it was for 12 years. Nobody could tell me why I was there. And the TAMS had just opened that week. And from what Westifer versus Snyder, the lawsuit that Law Center filed on our behalf, guys were sent there for retaliation for filing lawsuits and grievances. I had a buddy, Joe Sorrentino. One day he was making the warden steaks. The next day he was in TAMS. And so there was no rhyme or reason. And I was not segregation. I was called general population at TAMS. It's all solitary confinement prison, so how do you have general population? And this was all in writing. And it's sad. We had one kid that came there, he just turned 17, and within 6 months, he's on all sorts of psychotropic medication because he couldn't handle it. I had already did, 16 years in prison, and I couldn't handle it. So how is a poor kid going to deal with it? And like what Mark was saying, is they're taking the kids and it's just destroying them, and then we're your next door neighbors. We're the guy down the street, but look what my mom went through too. Alan came and do a deposition of me, and he reached out and shook my hand, which is the normal thing you do with somebody. He's the first person that had touched me in like 9 years, and I broke out sweating. My hands were shaking. It was like, where you been, in a cage? Yeah. I had had nobody touch me in all them years, and you lose that sensation. Where a week prior to going to TAMS, I was in New Mexico. I had contact visits with my family. We could have a trailer and sit out and barbecue. I did nothing wrong, not one rule violation. And then the 12 years in TAMS, it's like, they never filled the place up. They spent all that money to build this place, never filled it up, found out it was a colossal waste of money, and then most guys were there because they filed grievances or they had mental illnesses prior to TAMS. And what wardens were allowed to do is anybody that caused problems, they were able to ship to TAMS. So guys with mental illnesses that couldn't adapt to the rules were sent to TAMS and got even worse. And I've seen some horrific stuff, but nothing like what you see in solitary and you hear through the grapevines. You hear screaming all night long. The one warden or director from Colorado or Arizona, he locked himself in a cell and he couldn't believe it. And he goes, then we take the guys from solitary and put them on the bus and take the chains off at the bus. He goes, if I was on that bus, I'd run. And he's the director for the prisons or the warden for prisons out there. For him to say that is like, well, then why are you doing this? And that's like that reintegration thing that I needed. Why would you do this to me if you think I'm gonna come out here and be violently insane? Where is the medium ground? And you're talking about at least 6,000 guys throughout the state of Illinois in some type of solitary confinement. They've changed the name: circuit, the tombs, segregation, administrative detention, administrative confinement, high maximum security, temporary transfer inmate. And that's where they just transfer you from prison to prison and keep you on a wing by yourself. No human contact, so it's just changing the name where you ask, have they ruled on it? Well, they've ruled on it on some other names, and the Department of Corrections just changes the name. And it's sad when they didn't know why we were at TAMS, and they're running the prison system.
Any more questions?
Alan, solitary could be 18 hours, could be 24, it sort of depends.
Well, we've defined it as an average of 22 to 24 hours a day. In Illinois, actually, most people in solitary really spend 24 hours a day in a cell. By regulation, you're supposed to have an hour a day out of the cell, but first they define that as only weekdays, and then they often group that all together in one day. So for the other 6 days a week, you're in the cell 24 hours a day, and one day you may be on the yard 5 hours. Some of those yards, though, is a misnomer. At Pontiac, for example, the yards are what look like dog cages. They're maybe twice the size of this cell, and you're still in it alone with iron bars all around you, so it's just you in a slightly bigger cell. So when I use the word yard, don't think about those nice grassy areas with lots of people playing basketball and football and lifting weights. That's not what happens in solitary. You generally get a slightly bigger cell to exercise in, which has some exposure to outside.
One clarifying question. A few of you mentioned sharing these small cells with somebody else. Can you help define
Yes.
how solitary works when it comes to sharing a cell with somebody else?
Absolutely. First of all, because Illinois' prisons are so overcrowded, many of the segregation/solitary cells are in fact doubled up. Some people say, well, they're not really isolated. They're with somebody else. That must be a lot better. According to the psychologists and some of the folks here, it actually makes it worse because you're forced into very small quarters with another person. Brian just described how he would pace 18 hours a day. Imagine being in this cell with another man who's pacing 18 hours a day. It's going to drive you a lot crazier than if you were there by yourself. If anybody's ever cohabitated with somebody that you actually like, you often want to get some privacy. I got to go in the other room. I got to get some privacy. Imagine being in a much smaller, just your bathroom, with another person who you don't know at all, and never, ever, ever getting that privacy. So it's actually worse to be double-celled.
So just to be technical about it, the definition for solitary, it's about the size of the cell and the number of hours a day that you are inside that cell.
Without meaningful social contact, and that's the point. If you were out and if you were in a cell where you could actually mingle with other people, sit down and play cards and all that kind of thing, it'd be a different ballgame. But that's not what we're talking about. Enforced two people in the same space is not meaningful social contact.
And one more question. Do we have any idea how much money we're spending on the number of people we keep in solitary currently? Is it more expensive to keep people?
It's way more expensive to keep people in solitary. We do not have those numbers because the Department of Corrections doesn't break it out. Maximum security prisons are the most expensive places to house people. They are something on the order of $35,000 to $40,000 per prisoner per year. Segregation is even more because nobody gets out and does any work, so the guards are forced to do more work, and you need more guards to, anytime somebody moves in solitary, they're generally escorted one-on-one, so more guards are needed. The department doesn't break those numbers out. The numbers they have are somewhat misleading because they do not include things like pension costs, which are obviously a big deal in Illinois, but those are excluded from the department's budget. So the numbers the department puts up, which are about $28,000 a year, are simply not true. Yes?
I invite everybody, look at the cell where your head would be laying. The toilet's 6 inches away.
Can I
If you're
ask that
s-
question over there?
Yeah.
Yeah, just for comparison, to the approximately 2,300 people currently in solitary in Illinois, what is the Illinois prison population?
The Illinois prison population, it varies obviously daily, but it's somewhere on the order of 48,000 people. It's a little more than 5% of the total population in Illinois, and it's more than, I think, 20%. Remember the number from the complaint? More than 20% of the people who are in maximum security prisons are in segregation status.
Are there any particular bad offenders when it comes to the correctional facilities?
Yes.
Well, what are they?
Right. I figured that wasn't just a yes or no question. Most people who are in segregation in Illinois are housed at one of the 3 maximum security men's prisons, Menard, Pontiac, and Stateville. One of the problems in Illinois is that all of our maximum security prisons are very, very old. Our newest maximum security prison is Stateville, which was finished in 1920. There was a study done in the early 70s saying it had outlived its usefulness and ought to be closed down. It's not closed down, it's still there. And Menard and Pontiac are even older. Menard was started in the 1860s while the Civil War was still going on, and Pontiac was started in the early 1900s. So these are old, ancient facilities which should have been closed long ago. So I think they're probably the worst, but I don't want to say that a place like Lawrence is nice. It's cleaner, it's newer, but for example, many of the cells at Lawrence don't even have plugs. One of the ways this is sort of insane rules that they have, sometimes you're allowed to have a TV in solitary if you haven't had it taken away. But at Lawrence, they will give you a TV in a cell which doesn't have a plug in it, and then say, well, we gave you a TV. So you can stare at the blank screen, which personally would drive me batty. Like, okay, there's a TV there and I don't even get to watch it. And they've also restricted other things, like they take away cards. They take away your watches in solitary. Nobody's allowed to have a watch in solitary, so they don't even know how time passes. It's just, all of those things make it more and more torturous.
Who has the power to place someone in solitary? Is it just a guard can do it? Is it someone higher up the chain does? Someone at the Department of Correction have to get notification we're keeping this person for this long?
Not very far up the chain of command. We've described in the complaint the very complex paper process, but in fact what happens is a guard writes you a disciplinary report. His supervisor has to approve that disciplinary report. You get a hearing, and I'll explain hearings, but I want to put hearings in big quotes for a minute, before an adjustment committee, and ultimately the warden has to sign off on it. So those are supposed to be all those levels of review. But in fact, that so-called hearing often involves 2 people standing in front of your cell saying, do you have any comment, and then walking away. So it's 30 seconds. It's not like you actually present anything, any evidence. There's no evidence presented in your favor or against you. You never get to confront anybody who's telling you. Often it can be based on an anonymous informant. So the rules inside the Department of Corrections for real are, if a guard says you did it, you're guilty, and you're found guilty, and it's never overturned. So yes, there's a review, but no, it's not meaningful.
And administrative detention.
Right, no review at all.
Yes.
For administrative detention, which is 2 of our guys that are in the named plaintiffs, there's no review at all. You never get charged, you never get reviewed. If it's approved by the warden, you're there, and you can be there until somebody decides you ought to leave. There's absolutely nothing you can do to earn your way out of administrative detention.
You have people holding up signs saying they've been there for years. Does the department know that? Have they approved it?
Well-
Or is it just individual prisons are just putting them in there for that long?
Well, and what happens often is it's not really, the answer is no, is the short question. Because generally you're not sentenced for the full 10 years. you end up with maybe a year to start with, and then once you're in segregation, a guard says you did something wrong in segregation and gives you another 30 days, and then you do something else wrong and they give you another 6 months, and you end up spending 10 years, 23 years in solitary, but it's a rolling sort of thing. So most people, almost nobody is sentenced to more than a year in solitary, but those years can accumulate and people end up spending 5, 10, 15 years in solitary.
And last summer, we had guys from various prisons go on hunger strike because they wanted to know when they could ever get out of administrative detention.
Right.
They had been there for 10 years already. How do we get out?
Right.
There's no rules.
No path out.
Are there any more questions?
Does that-
You got one more in there. Give some.
Context of the lawsuit, what counts as overuse or inhumane conditions, or I guess if you succeed, in what capacity would solitary confinement continue if at all?
Obviously, that would be up to the judge. We are not asking in this lawsuit for the state to abolish solitary entirely. We are asking the state to adopt the standards that were adopted by the American Bar Association a couple of years ago after a year-long study process which brought together people from all walks, including correctionals, lawyers, as well as prisoner advocates, and they came up with a set of standards. So all we're really asking is that Illinois, comply with the national standards. And those national standards have to do with how long you can be in, the time you're allowed out of your cell, and a proportionality claim. That if you're going to send people for a long time into solitary, they have to have done something serious. It also involves keeping people who are mentally ill out of solitary and into treatment where they belong rather than dumping them into solitary. And that's obviously summary. It's 2 pages in our complaint of all the things we're asking for, but that's a brief summary of the highlights. Any more questions? Yes?
I guess why not? Why didn't you go to say abolish it? It should be abolished.
I think the law is not there. We don't want to ask for something that is just going to get thrown out of court. I think that the Supreme Court is not ready to say that solitary should be abolished. Even the United Nations has said 15 days in solitary is okay. So I don't think we can argue that it ought to be abolished entirely as a matter of a legal opinion, whether it's politically a good idea, whether it's morally a good idea, whether it is for running a good correctional system a good idea. I think it would be a great idea for all those reasons. But I don't think we can make a legal claim that it ought to be abolished entirely, just that it ought to be used reasonably.